In 1917, while American men fought for democracy overseas, women were fighting for it at home. Outside the White House, suffragists stood with banners demanding liberty and equality. Their question was simple: how long must women wait for liberty? The women outside the White House acted peacefully and with discipline. They didn't shout or use violence; instead, they stood silently with their signs. Their calm and respectful behavior showed strength and determination, but the police and some onlookers reacted harshly. Instead of respecting their calm protest, the police arrested them, and some people mocked or attacked them. Lucy Burns and Alice Paul were leading suffragists who co-founded the National Woman's Party, NWP, to secure the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote. They were known for their militant tactics, which included the 1913 women's suffrage procession and the Silent Sentinels protests outside the White House, leading to their arrests and hunger strikes. African American women across the country were very active and working towards the vote. Their view was a much broader view than the white women. The white women were narrowly focused on one thing: getting the vote. The African American women had a much broader social agenda, because although African American men had been given the vote in the 15th Amendment, they, in many parts of the country, were not allowed to vote under the very strict Jim Crow laws that were then in effect. While soldiers fought abroad, women waged their own battle for democracy at home. During World War I, women took on vital roles across the nation. They worked in factories, ran farms, and kept offices operating while millions of men served abroad. Thousands also volunteered as nurses and relief workers, risking their lives to heal the wounded. In addition to these roles, some women served in military jobs, including as pilots, where they demonstrated their capability and bravery in support of the war effort. These women proved that their strength, skill, and sacrifice were essential to the nation's survival and to its promise of democracy. On September 30, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson delivered a speech to the Senate, declaring that women's suffrage was a necessary war measure. He argued that women's vital contributions to the war effort meant they deserved the right to vote, and that it was essential for the nation's post-war moral and political health.
I'd rather see my children dead than return them to slavery. On a freezing January morning in 1856, U.S. Marshals burst into a small cabin near Cincinnati. Inside, they found Margaret Garner, a 22-year-old mother who has escaped slavery with her family holding a butcher knife. One of her children was dead. She had tried to kill all 4 of them. This article, published in the Cincinnati Gazette, shows the description of the incident. In February '56, indictment papers charged Margaret Garner with murder in Ohio, but the case was never tried. Federal authorities instead reclaimed her under the Fugitive Slave Act. Many newspapers described her actions as unnatural, but abolitionists argued they were the most human act imaginable. A mother trying to protect her children from a system worse than death. The transcription of Garner's rendition quotes Margaret's own words: "I was as cool as I now am. I would much rather kill them at once and thus end their sufferings than have them taken back to slavery and be murdered by piecemeal." Margaret Garner's tragic story was so powerful that it later became the inspiration for Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved. Margaret's choice wasn't an outlier. It exposed the rules of a world where law named mothers property. To understand how that law worked inside everyday homes, return south and look closely at what motherhood meant under slavery. In the quiet rooms of San Antonio's grand houses, the first cry of a white child often meant the forced silence of a black one. Enslaved mothers, women who had just given birth, were taken from their infants to feed the babies of their enslavers. Their own children were left hungry while their milk, their bodies, were claimed as property. This was called wet nursing. In Bear Counter records from the 19th century, these women are listed simply as ama de leche, wet nurse. Their names rarely appear, only their age, their price, and the fact that they could feed another woman's child. In the words of a woman interviewed in Texas decades later, white women wouldn't nurse their own babies because it would make their breasts fall. She would nurse her baby and the white baby too. They would feed her everything she wanted. She didn't have to work because milk would be hot to give to babies. Others remembered their mothers being called in from the fields to nurse a white infant, while they would forbid to nurse their own babies, and some women would do it secretly. In the words of Fanny Clemens, she said her old miss wouldn't let her come to the house to nurse me, so she would slip up under a house and crawl through a hole in the floor. She took and pulled a plank up so she could slip through. Wet nursing wasn't kindness, it was a system of control, a way to profit from black women's fertility, to make their milk nourish the oppressor's children while starving their own. This practice built intimate, violent bonds between enslaved women and white families, bonds that erased their motherhood in favor of someone else's lineage. The story of one woman, Clarissa, shows this reality. In October 1848, a bill of sale record shows Clarissa being sold with her daughters Emily, Betsy, and an unnamed infant. 5 years later, another sale lists Clarissa with a 6-year-old girl named Caroline and a 3-year-old boy named Erwin. They were stated to be Clarissa's children. They're being described as having light hair and light eyes. This could be a sign of them being the children of Clarissa and one of their white enslavers. Emily and Betsy completely vanished from the record. No names, no trace, no explanation. They were most likely sold to another buyer or died before adulthood. Imagine loving a child you could not protect. Imagine raising them knowing they might be sold, raped, or used to breed more laborers. We cannot undo their pain, but we can refuse to forget them. Mothers like Clarissa, whose children vanished from the record, telling their stories completes the history.
What would you do if on your way to school or work you were asked to strip naked and be doused in gasoline before you could continue on about your day? Well, that's exactly what happened to Carmelita Torres on January 28, 1917. The Bath riots, led by Carmelita Torres, were more than just a protest against these local injustices. They highlighted the severe impact of American eugenics and xenophobia, unmasking how these ideologies influenced subsequent global atrocities. Torres' defiance brought international attention to the inhumane treatment of Mexican immigrants and emphasized the dangerous connections between US border practices and Nazi Germany's genocidal policies. Before 1917, immigration looked very different in the US, especially on the US-Mexico border. Mexican nationals were free to come and go from the US, with many of them crossing into the US routinely to work, study, or just visit. In 1917, the political atmosphere in the US was changing, with the US joining World War I and outbreaks of typhus, heightening tensions between Americans and minorities throughout the US. Immigrants were targeted as international issues arose, and fears spawned that they would bring in typhus fever and other diseases. During this time, the Immigration Act of 1917 passed, where any person coming into the US internationally had new measures to go through, including a literacy test, a new immigration tax, and increased discrimination given to immigration officers. During these changes, newly elected El Paso Mayor Tom Lee, who had built his entire campaign on his obsession with cleanliness, claimed that Mexicans coming into the US were riddled with disease, specifically typhus. He called to the U.S. public health official, General Surgeon Claude Connor Pierce. These disinfection stations consisted of stopping with the U.S. along the second-class citizens border to disinfect Mexicans coming into the U.S. They would then be inspected by U.S. officials, checked for lice, and given kerosene baths, then sprayed with a toxic chemical cocktail, including the since-banned pesticide DDT and Zyklon B, which were then a direct influence in the building of Nazi gas chambers. In the meantime, their clothes and shoes would be passed through steam washes so hot that sometimes their shoes would even melt. These practices were terribly dehumanizing and dangerous. And one day, a 17-year-old maid coming in to work from El Paso from Juarez, Mexico, had had enough. Her name was Carmelita Torres. On the trolley coming into the U.S., Carmelita convinced everyone in the trolley, mostly women that were coming into work, to say no to the officials who stopped them at the checkpoint. Soon, 200 women were protesting the chemical baths, and a couple hours later, the crowd grew to 2,000 people, with both men and women throwing rocks and bottles at the guards. The protest, led by the brave young teenage girl, came to be known as the Bath Riot, and resulted in a 3-day shutdown of the US-Mexico border. Despite the brave efforts of Carmelita and the women who stood alongside her, the delousing continued, with over 100,000 Mexicans being treated in 1917 alone, and these practices did not end until 1964, with further international outcomes of Nazi scientists citing the El Paso delousing stations as a major influence on their gas chambers and the use of the chemical Zyklon B. Carmelita Torres' courage is not something that should be forgotten, but rather should serve as a powerful reminder of the need to confront and challenge inhumane treatment and discriminatory practices. Her story sheds light on a dark chapter in history, showing how policies born out of fear and prejudice can have far-reaching and devastating consequences.
Perú, un país lleno de vida, de colores, de sonidos, de talentos, tierra de montañas, océano y esperanza. Pero detrás de nuestra historia hay un capítulo casi olvidado, uno que nació del miedo y separó a cientos de familias. En febrero de 1944, más de 600 hombres, mujeres y niños fueron sacados de sus hogares en Perú. En esta lista sus nombres parecen simples palabras, pero detrás de cada uno hay una historia de miedo, pérdida y desarraigo. Eran peruanos con apellidos alemanes y por eso se convirtieron en enemigos en una guerra que no era la suya. Antes de la guerra, la comunidad alemana en Perú era parte del día a día. Maestros, panaderos, agricultores. Pero en 1942 todo cambió. Bajo la presión de los Estados Unidos, el gobierno peruano deportó a cientos de personas de ascendencia alemana. Los llamaron enemigos, aunque muchos ni siquiera ya hablaban alemán. Los subieron a un barco, el MS Griffsholm, y los enviaron a campos en Estados Unidos. Algunos niños fueron enviados solos, otros nunca volvieron a ver a sus padres. Fueron separados por una guerra que no entendían y olvidados por países que los consideraban extranjeros. Sus cartas quedaron sin respuesta, sus nombres casi borrados de la historia. Hoy, sus descendientes buscan rostros, cartas, historias, buscan volver a unir lo que la guerra rompió. No piden venganza, solo memoria, porque recordar también es una forma de justicia. Eran peruanos, eran alemanes, pero sobre todo eran humanos. Sus nombres viajaron por el mar, pero su corazón siempre se quedó aquí, en la tierra que los vio nacer. Que su historia no se pierda en el silencio, porque la memoria también es amor. Y aunque el tiempo los haya separado, nos sigue uniendo el mismo sentimiento. Contigo, Perú.
Eres muy grande, lo seguirás siendo, pues todos estamos contigo, Perú. Sobre mi pecho llevo tus colores y están mis amores contigo, Perú. Somos tus hijos y nos uniremos y así triunfaremos contigo, Perú. Unida la costa, unida la costa, unida la sierra, unida la selva contigo, Perú. Unido el trabajo, unido el deporte, unidos el norte, el centro y el sur. A triunfar, peruanos, que somos hermanos, que se haga victoria nuestra gratitud. Te daré la vida y cuando yo muera, me uniré en la tierra contigo, Perú. ¡Vamos allá! Te daré la vida y cuando yo muera, me uniré en la tierra contigo, Perú.
Beneath the veneer of his respected position lies a dire secret, a tragic reality in which young Raymond, merely 10 years old, lives enslaved and forgotten. Franklin Lafayette Paschal was born on January 15, 1810, in Lexington, Georgia. He came to Texas as a second lieutenant, later serving in the Army of the Republic of Texas and as a Texas Ranger. By 1839, he had settled in Texas and built up a mass amount of land, influence, and power. Paschal served as Bexar County coroner, sheriff, and the representative in the Republic of Texas legislature. He also held roles on the San Antonio City Council as tax collector and as court crier. Paschal is often remembered as a soldier and a legislator, but behind the honors, he was also an enslaver. When I first embarked on this project, initial documents indicated that Paschal was the enslaver of a 10-year-old boy named Henry. However, upon a deeper investigation into historical records, it became apparent that this boy's name was actually Raymond. Raymond was described as having a black complexion, being warranted sound in mind and body, and as being indefatigable. Raymond was sold for $425, which today would be worth over $15,000. While there is an abundance of documentation detailing Franklin's contributions to Texas history, Raymond's existence seems to be nothing more than a fleeting mention. His life, experiences, and struggles have been obscured by time, leaving us with an incomplete narrative of his existence. In contrast to the well-preserved accounts of Paschal, Raymond's story has been lost, serving as a stark reminder of the countless untold stories of those who have lived in the shadows. Despite my efforts to uncover the truth, Raymond's life remains a mystery, and his story may never fully be known. Sadly, the same goes for the other 40-plus people that Paschal enslaved. Franklin Lafayette Paschal was listed on the Bexar County tax records as early as 1845, and he continued enslaving people for nearly 2 decades. His wife, Frances Paschal, also enslaved people, starting in the year 1857. According to the Bexar County tax records, Franklin and Frances combined enslaved just under 50 individuals valued at $20,000. Today, this would be worth over $852,000. Paschal died of pneumonia in San Antonio on February 13, 1884, and he was laid to rest with great honor. Texas veterans carried his casket, and many people joined the ceremony to pay their respects, recognizing Paschal's impact on Texas history. On Paschal's headstone, an emblem reads, "Texas Revolutionary War Veteran." It's a symbol of who people wanted him to be remembered as, a hero and a patriot. But notice what's missing. There's no mention of the people he enslaved, and no hint of the lives that he controlled. Franklin Lafayette Paschal's contributions as a soldier and a legislator were remembered fondly by many who knew him. Yet, in polarizing contrasts, Raymond received no such recognition or celebration of life. The details of Raymond's passing, much like those of his life, are shrouded in mystery. We have no records of who mourned him or what family connections he may have had. While Paschal's legacy was cemented in the archives of history, Raymond's existence remains an obscured fragment, leaving us to wonder about the life he led and the people who might have cared for him in his silent departure.
Jeff Hamilton from Slavery to Freedom, 1840 to 1941. This is the story of Jeff Hamilton, born enslaved in Kentucky in 1840 and brought to Texas as a small child. His life would cross paths with one of Texas's most significant leaders, Sam Houston, and carry him from slavery into a century of Texas history. In the 1850s, enslaved children in Texas were bought and sold as property. In 1852, 12-year-old Jeff Hamilton was sold in Trinity County for $450. His enslaver, James McKell, was known for drinking and mistreatment. The sale tore Jeff away from his mother and sisters. That day, Senator Sam Houston was in Trinity County. When he saw the crying child, he purchased him and brought him into his home. Houston bought Jeff a straw hat with a feather to comfort him, something Jeff remembered for the rest of his life. Jeff's early journey took him from Kentucky to Fort Bend County, then to Moscow, Greenville, and Old Sumter in Trinity County. After the sale, he moved into the Houston home in Huntsville. Unlike many enslaved people, Jeff lived inside the house. Growing up with the Houston children and learning daily responsibilities, Jeff served Houston during political campaigns and as his office boy. When Houston became governor, he met major historical figures and learned reading, writing, and moral lessons from the Houston family. Sam Houston opposed secession and freed his enslaved people in 1862. Before emancipation reached Texas, Jeff chose to remain with the family, helping care for Houston in his final days. After Houston's death, Jeff moved with Mrs. Houston to Independence, Texas. He later worked as a janitor at Baylor Female College from 1889 to 1903. When the school relocated to Belton, he moved as well. After the Civil War, Jeff searched for his mother and eventually found her. She recognized him instantly by the burn scar on his leg. She showed him a Bible she had kept for decades, containing the notes that revealed his birth date and his father's name. As an adult, Jeff married Sarah Maxey and raised 11 children. He became a respected voice at Texas historical events, especially during the Texas Centennial. In 1937, he stood beside Sam Houston's last surviving son to honor the family he had served and loved. Jeff Hamilton lived from 1840 to 1941, more than a century. It spanned slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and modern Texas. He died in Belton, honored for the remarkable life he carried. His story reminds us that behind every major figure in history are people whose lives witnessed pain, transformation, and resilience. Jeff Hamilton's journey from slavery to freedom is one of the most powerful stories in Texas history. Thanks for watching.
A historical examination of Merritt M. Coates. On October 2nd, 1823, Merritt M. Coates signed a will. He freed Violet and her children, but what happened after? Merritt M. Coates did something almost unheard of. He wrote a will freeing an enslaved woman named Violet and her young son Carter. Merritt was listed in the colony census of 1826. The census was listed as Mr. Brown M. Coates, a farmer, stock raiser, and a single man aged between 25 and 40. Before Texas was Texas, the land had already had roads, just not the kind we imagine today. One of them, the Cushata and the Natchitoches Trace, carved its way across East Texas. It connected indigenous villages, Spanish outposts, and trade centers like Nacogdoches and Opelousas. Merritt M. Coates, one of Stephen F. Austin's old 300 colonists, received title to Cito of land now in Waller Country on July 19, 1824. This land was designated as Cito de Gran Mayor, a large ranching site. In 1826, a land for Brown M. Coates, also known as Merritt M. Coates, was officially recorded in Stephen F. Austin's map collection. Surveyed by Bartlett Samuel Sims and approved by Austin himself, the map includes detailed field notes marking Coates' league of land in Texas. This was a sign of wealth and power. For Violet, the woman once enslaved, this land for her became a lifeline. Merritt gave them not just their freedom, but land, property, and a promise that his attorney Andrew Robinson would carry out their emancipation. Freedom in Texas was not simple, though. Coates' will had to be legally confirmed again and again, once in 1843 and again in 1847, and even in 1854. Multiple witnesses, officials, clerks signed off just to prove that Violet's freedom was real and that her and her children had a legal right to exist out of bondage. Later affidavits revealed Violet had 2 more children, Martha and Parthena. In 1842, Parthena married. This shows a remarkable act of independence for the daughter of a woman once enslaved. The most important part of this recognition Violet had, she wasn't just freed, she was recognized as a mother, a landowner, and a woman whose humanity could no longer be denied. Merritt M. Coates died owning 12 acres of land, a wife, and enslaved people. His legacy is complicated, marked by ownership and control, but through the story of Violet and her children, we glimpse resilience, survival, and the fight for dignity in a land defined by conquest and slavery. Thank you.
James Weir and the enslaved boy Stephen, a debt paid in human lives, dedicated to those whose stories were erased from the record. In 1851, a small piece of paper quietly carried a heavy story. It recorded a debt between James Weir and the family of Anderson Berry, but hidden in the lines was something darker. A boy named Stephen, treated not as a child, but as a property. Benjamin and Jane Berry gave up all rights to their son's estate, including the boy Stephen, to pay off a $6,000 debt owed to James Weir. In the mid-1800s, James Weir was a wealthy landowner and a slaver in Kentucky and Texas. The Berry family, also from Kentucky, owed him money for land investments in Texas. Land and lives were part of America's growing economic slavery. Anderson Berry, the Berry's son, borrowed $6,000 from Weir, over $200,000 today. He died before repaying it. After Anderson's death, the court sold everything he owned. At a public auction, James Weir purchased most of Anderson's belongings, land, tools, and people, for $4,422. 23 enslaved people recorded under James Weir's name. Documents show that James Weir enslaved 23 people. Each was listed only by age, sex, and color, but not by name. Stephen was one of the few names that survived on paper. Tax records show the total value of Weir's enslaved people as $50,000 the price of land, livestock, and human beings combined. The Berrys surrendered the boy Stephen to Weir, saying they gave up all rights to him and to their son's estate. This was their way of paying the debt. Stories like Stephen remind us that slavery was not just history, it was lived reality. Each name in these records tells a human story. Stephen's life was reduced to property, his name almost lost. Would the record help us remember him?
In November 1918, 2 weeks after the armistice ended World War I in Europe, a small First family laid down their arms in the remote wilderness of northern Rhodesia. They were the last Germans to surrender, and their commander had never lost a battle. Paul-Emil von Lett to W.V. Urbeck was born in Prussia in 1870, but his legend was forged in the heart of Africa. When World War I erupted, this German lieutenant colonel commanded just 14,000 men, mostly Afrikaner soldiers in the vast territory of German East Africa. Against overwhelming odds, Lett to W.V. Urbeck waged the most successful guerrilla campaign in military history. His strategy was simple, but brilliant: tie down as many British troops as possible, keeping them away from the crucial Western Front. For years, his small force led 300,000 Allied soldiers on a chase across some of the world's most challenging terrain. It began at Tonga in November 1914, where Lett to W.V. Urbeck's troops routed a British invasion for 8 times their size. The battle became known as the Battle of the Bees, when disturbed hives added chaos to the fighting. The Germans captured desperately needed supplies and weapons that would sustain them throughout the war. What made Lett to W.V. Urbeck extraordinary was not just his tactical brilliance but his relationship with his Afrikaner soldiers. Fluent in Swahili, he promoted black officers and reportedly declared, "We are all Africans here." His askari remained fiercely loyal, even as the war turned desperate. When the war finally ended, Lett to W.V. Urbeck marched his undefeated force to Abercorn and formally surrendered. He returned to Germany as a national hero, later standing up to Hitler and the Nazis. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the respect he earned from both enemies, the Afrikaner soldiers who called him their leader. Paul-Emil von Lett to W.V. Urbeck, the Lion of Africa, proved that leadership transcends race and that honor can emerge even from the darkest chapters of colonial history.
When most Americans think about independence, they think of 4th of July, 1776. We eat our hot dogs, wave our flags, and fireworks go off. The sky lights up in red, white, and blue. But here in Texas, our story is different. Texas was never ruled by Great Britain. Our fight for independence came from another place, Mexico. In the early 1800s, Texas wasn't Texas yet. It was Spanish territory. Wild, vast, and barely settled by any Europeans. Then, in 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. Suddenly, Texas became part of this brand new country. Mexico wanted settlers to develop the land, so they created a system of empresarios, men who would be granted land in exchange for bringing families to Texas. One of the most famous was Stephen F. Austin, often called the father of Texas. Austin helped bring hundreds of settlers and establish San Felipe de Austin, which became a hub for Anglo-American immigration into Texas. At first, it seemed like a good deal, but as more settlers came, cultural clashes grew. Texans spoke English, not Spanish, and they were used to a local self-rule, not a central government far away in Mexico City. And one of the sharpest conflicts was slavery. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829. But many Anglo settlers came from South United States and brought enslaved people with them. To settlers, Mexico's anti-slavery laws felt like a threat to their livelihood. To Mexican leaders, settlers were ignoring their country's laws. Then came Antonio López de Santa Anna. At first, he presented himself as a federalist, supporting states' rights. But when he rose to power, he threw out Mexico's Constitution of 1824 and made himself a dictator. He demanded absolute control, and for many Texans, both Anglo settlers and Tejanos, that was the breaking point. By 1835, the situation erupted into open rebellion. The first shots of the Texas Revolution were fired at the Battle of Gonzales, when Mexican soldiers tried to reclaim a small cannon given to the settlers for defense. The Texans raised the flag that read, "Come and take it." And after a brief fight, the Mexicans retreated. It was a small battle, but it lit the spark of revolution. Only a few months later, delegates met at Washington on the Brazos. On March 2, 1836, they signed the Texas Declaration of Independence. declaring Texas a free and independent republic. But even as they signed, fighting was still raging. At the Alamo in San Antonio, fewer than 200 Texan defenders, including names like Davy Crockett, William B. Travis, and James Bowie. Santana's troops waited for 13 days before attacking on March 16th. The Texan army was ultimately overwhelmed, but their sacrifice gave the revolution a rallying cry: "Remember the Alamo." Years earlier, the Mexican Congress had passed a law stating that anyone who took up arms against the Republic would be executed without trial. Not long after, at Goliad, nearly 400 Texan prisoners were executed under Santana's orders, in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. The Mexican general who had originally granted the Texan prisoners of war status was actually defying the law. So when Santana ordered the executions, he was enforcing a policy that already existed. It may have been harsh, but legal under Mexican authority at the time. News of what happened at Goliad spread quickly, and it fueled outrage across Texas. For many settlers, it confirmed that the conflict had reached a point of no return. As Santana's army advanced, Texan settlers fled eastward, in what was called the Runaway Scrape. Most of us grew up hearing terrorizing stories that Mexican troops were burning down towns and threatening civilians. The story paints it as a desperate escape for safety, but the reality was very different. Settlers with their slaves were racing towards Louisiana, afraid that Santana would free them under Mexican law. Santana's troops did not burn homes or towns, nor did they harm civilians. In fact, the fear that spread among settlers came from their own efforts to keep enslaved people from running towards the Mexican army, which promised them freedom. The version of the story that is often told has survived because it preserves a heroic myth rather than acknowledging that slavery played a central role in the conflict. As settlers pushed east, Sam Houston's army was moving in a different direction, straight toward the fight that would decide it all: the Battle of San Jacinto. On April 21, 1836, General Sam Houston led his outnumbered Texan army in a surprise attack on Santana's forces. In just 18 minutes, the battle was won. The Texans shouted, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" and they stormed the Mexican camp. Santana himself was captured the next day, disguised in a soldier's uniform. Under pressure, Santana signed the Treaty of Velasco, which marked the end of the fighting. After years of tension and months of brutality fighting, Texas was free. Even after Texas declared itself free, the story didn't end there. Slavery expanded rapidly during the years of the Republic, and many Texans remained afraid that Mexico, where slavery was illegal, might try to take the region back. That uncertainty lingered for more than a decade. It wasn't until 12 years after Texas declared its independence that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, officially settling the border and bringing Mexico's claim to an end. For nearly a decade, Texas stood as its own nation, the Republic of Texas, before joining the United States in 1845. But that's another story. So yes, we celebrate the 4th of July as Americans, but if we're talking about the real Texas independence, the day is March 2nd, 1836, the day Texas declared itself free, and the day a new nation was born.
You can catch them, the money is yours. All you need to know about the newly escaped slaves. Those has releasing a statement describing the runaways and offering a reward for them. Here, I'll walk you through it. We have a $200 reward for each, 100, and he describes them as wearing coat-on clothes and heavy wimpy jackets, and then a more accurate description of the horse they stole. Then we have George, who's the first one of them. He's very likely has bright countenance. He speaks readily, near 6 feet high, small skull and forehead, has lost his forefinger on his left hand. Then there's Wiley. He's about 4 feet 4 inches high, compactly set, small feet, dark countenance, snuffs, nose, small eyes, and slow of speech. And here are the range of rewards one could get depending on how far they are caught. If they're caught in the Mexican frontier or in the Mexican territory, that's where it'll be the most reward. Well, there was not much information about George. There is information about the other runway, and you could see here it was provided by Mr. Goodlow. Let's dive into it. This is a similar sort of name. His arrival to Texas was on this date, and it coincides when he came here to work under Mr. Goodlow. So let's remember to support Mr. Goodlow in this hard endeavor. Keep him in your prayers. Since he moved here, he has been nothing but an outstanding member of this community. He's part of the Post Oak patrol officers, and he has been trying to put a stop to these runways. So once again, keep him in your prayers, and let's hope that George can come back to his senses and return to San Antonio as soon as possible. And the other escapee, I hope he's never allowed to terrorize this town ever again. There has also been witness accounts, people who have been there when they broke out, of them trying to destroy a fence and trying to kidnap a child. And I think that's just unacceptable. Be whoever you are, that's just unacceptable. And I don't think you should be doing that. I am actually one of Goodlow's neighbors. I saw George and Wiley escape, and it was nothing like that lady described. I do know where they went, but I will not do anything or say anything that will reveal their current position and risk their security and their safety. But I will say that they left a note with me so that their voices could be heard, which I am about to read right now. It says, "We are sick and tired of being mistreated, overworked, and abused. We will not stop escaping from the man who bought us and exploited us since we were children. We will seek freedom even if we die trying." This is the only thing that's left in this note. And please help them reach the border.